If you're looking to install some lockers in your mudroom for your family to use, keep watching this video because I will break down all of the components that I use to turn this ugly thing into this. Let's get right to it. The first thing that you want to do is make sure that you get all of your measurements taken and create a basic drawing, just something on a sheet of paper like this that gives you all of your measurements and lays it out the way that you're planning to install. This will help you nail down all of the cuts that you need to make so you're only going out and making cuts once. It will make your life a heck of a lot easier if you get this part right before you move forward. Now in our house we were using these IKEA shelves for about 3 years. They created more of a problem than a benefit for us because it just became a parking area for all of the junk in the house. My solution was to come up with something that had less shelves so that we would pile less stuff on it and keep it a little bit more organized and neat. So step number 1 for us was to clear off these shelves and get them out of the room. I'll be using these shelves for another project in the future. Once you have the area cleared, you can also remove your baseboards. I always start this by scoring the top with my razor knife. This just creates a little bit of a gap between the top of the baseboard and the wall and eliminates that caulk so you can get through it. Now this is where the magic happens. And if you do not have one of these tools, make sure you pick up a Goldblatt trim remover. I love this tool to death. The top flat part of the tool is made for the hammer. This is where you knock it down inside behind the back of the baseboard. Once you get this behind the baseboard, you simply pull up and you'll see that these two parts separate. That pulls the baseboard away from the wall. Just work your way right down the wall and do this several times. The entire baseboard will come out so easy. The best part is, it doesn't really mark up your walls. And now for one of the longest parts of this entire job, cutting. I cut more plywood than I have cut in a really long time. All of the sides for the lockers, all of the tops and the bottoms for the lockers, the sides, the middles, the top, the bottom, for the base, the top, the entire thing. I cut all of my plywood at once so that all I would have to do is assemble it after the fact. I chose to use pocket hole screws to attach everything for this project. Now I've used a Kreg jig for years now, but I bought the Kreg 720 to make this job go faster, and this thing was lightning fast. I've never done pocket hole screws this fast. So my second step was to take all of the pieces that I cut and get my pocket holes drilled into every piece that required it. And to attach with those pocket holes, I'm using 1 1/4 inch Kreg pocket hole screws, and I went with 1 1/4 because I'm using 3/4 inch plywood. Now like a dummy, when I started to assemble my base and gluing these pieces together, I was using an old Elmer's wood glue that I had laying around because I didn't have the glue that I needed just yet. Please don't do this. Buy the right glue from the start, and I highly recommend Titebond 2. These Titebond glues are fantastic. They work on all sorts of woods, and honestly, they're just way easier to work with. Now taking a quick step back, one of the things that you also need to make sure you do is sand all of the pieces that are going to be visible. Here's what I mean. I purchased 3/4 inch maple sanded plywood. Now it's sanded, but it's not sanded perfectly. You want to make sure you have a very smooth surface before you put any paint, primer, or anything on this material. With everything sanded, now I can get to the assembly. I used clamps on every single corner to ensure my pieces were flush when I glued them and when I installed all of these pocket hole screws. For the lockers, I installed the tops and the bottoms first, and then I put 3 pieces in the back. One large one in the top because I'm going to be putting hooks in the backs of my lockers and I wanted a big area that I could screw into. I did one in the bottom, and I also put one in the middle. This is for stability, and then also if I need to attach anything in the future, but also for a little something extra special when I did the finishing on these lockers. We'll get there soon. One quick note about these pocket hole screws. After you drill and put the screws into them, you'll notice that there are holes left over, but Kreg was way ahead on this one. They created these pocket hole plugs that you can put in the holes. All you have to do is spread glue around the outside of them and put them in. Once they dry, you can either sand it down or trim it down and then sand it, and it looks perfect. Once you get all of your pieces assembled, please, please, please dry fit everything before you start to install a thing. Here's why. When I dry fit all of my pieces, I ran into a bit of a problem. I realized that my measurements, the planning at the beginning of this process, were off. And it was because of a bonehead mistake that I made in my math. When I did my measurements, for some reason I was thinking that I would be attaching my sides and my tops like this, my top going into my side. When I actually put the lockers together, my tops went into the top of my sides. What this basically means is that I immediately took 3/4 of an inch off of every side of every locker. At 1.5 inches per locker, 4 lockers, that was 6 inches short. I saw it immediately in the middle, and I saw it very clearly on the far end. Now, after I had a moment where I quite legitimately freaked out a little bit, my wife came up with a brilliant idea to turn this extra section into mail slots, something that we've actually wanted to put in this mudroom anyway. So on my base, I moved my centerpieces, I put one in place, made sure that it was in the right spot, and then I took my second piece and put it right up next to it and screwed from the other side of the first into it to keep it in place. I also added an extra piece down at the end for the end of the 4th locker. I didn't really get a good recording of it, but you can see it over here in this shot. That's gonna be a package slot right next to these shoe areas on this base piece. I also installed my shelves. Now that I know I have all of my vertical pieces in the right spot, I used spacers to ensure that both shelves would be installed at the exact same height on this base. So I did one more dry fit just to make sure everything was gonna go in appropriately, and then I moved on to my least favorite step. I primed all of these pieces. Now, I hate painting. I don't know if you've heard me say this before, but when it comes to painting, if I'm using a power tool, it makes it a little less painful. So I went out in the backyard and I sprayed primer on all of these pieces. I wanted to ensure that when they went in, it was going to be easier to paint them and it wouldn't be a real pain in the rear end to prime it all in place. Now I ended up cutting a hole out of this wall because I know there's a cinder block wall behind the drywall and it's just furring strips there. And I really wanted to make sure that I had the exact position of those strips nailed down. With that section out, I just used my level to mark where those strips are so I know where I need to insert my screws. I created a base for the bottom of my bottom portion of these lockers. It's constructed out of 2x4s and I left enough to have a 3-inch overhang right in the front of the lockers. The purpose of this was to ensure that when we all walked up to the lockers, our feet would not go right into the front of them. And the next piece is to get that 2x4 base in place. You need to make sure that you shim this appropriately. Just go buy a pack of shims at Lowe's or Home Depot, but shim this appropriately so that it is level. If this is not level, it will throw off the entire project. So take time with this step. Make sure you shim it properly. Once you confirm that it's level, you can now screw it into the studs in your wall. With all of this done, we can move on to the best part of the project. Full installation. Now that we have our 2x4 base in place, we can put our actual bottom portion of our lockers in place. We do need to make sure that this is perfectly level before we move forward. If it is not level, all of your lockers will be out of whack and it will be very hard to install them when we get to that point. Now I've had spacers at both ends because I'm putting a 3/4 inch plywood cap on both sides. I need to make sure that I have this position in the right place before I drive my screws into the base. Speaking of which, once I had it positioned properly, I drove screws through the bottom of this bottom portion into that 2x4 base, and I also put some into the wall, into the studs behind it to make sure it does not move. Now it's time to bring the lockers in for one last dry fit. The whole purpose here is to get a good idea as to where we're going to mount and how we're going to mount them to the wall once we get them into position. Now once I got mine into position, I saw that I had a small gap behind it that would be very tough to shim. So I decided to pull the lockers down, cut a section of drywall out, and I'm mounting a pine board directly to those studs. This will be my screw board for the tops of the lockers. Getting locker number 1 positioned properly is key because it will help you get the remainder of the lockers, no matter how many you're putting in place, in the right spot. So take your time getting this locker in place before you screw it into anything. To screw this locker into place, I'm using 1¼ inch wood screws. Being 3/4 inch plywood, I don't want to go beyond 1.5 inches when I connect these, so 1¼ works out perfectly. I clamped the base of the first locker to the bottom portion of the locker system which I just installed. I pre-drilled 4 holes and put my screws directly into it so that it anchors the bottom to that base. Next, I need to anchor the top of it up against the wall. With that pine board behind, it makes it easier for me to shim the top of this locker, making sure that it's level before you drive any screws into that board. For the top screws, I'm using 2.5-inch cabinet screws in order to mount it to the wall. I'm simply screwing right through my shims into that pine board to ensure that I have a tight fit up against that wall. With that first locker in place, it makes lockers 2, 3, and 4 a heck of a lot easier to install. There's only one difference here. With locker number 2, I positioned it right up against locker number 1, confirmed level, screwed it into the base. Now, I also used the same 2.5-inch cabinet screws to get the top screwed into the back, shimmed it just like I did the very first locker, and then screwed it through the shims. I also, just to make sure that this thing is solid, am screwing the left side of locker number 2 into the right side of locker number 1. I'm just looking for additional stability here, and I want those pieces to be nice and tight for when I put my face frame on. With locker 2 in place, now you just have to rinse and repeat that exact same process on lockers 3 and 4. I chose to add a top section to this entire locker system so that we can put bags and other large items up above the lockers themselves. I positioned that large piece up on top of the lockers and made sure that it was flush with the sides on both ends and in the front. To anchor this in place, I screwed into the tops of the lockers with those same 1.25-inch screws. I also drove some screws after I shimmed the back of it into the studs in the wall. Now when I installed that base piece, I put the 3/4-inch plywood spacers on both ends for that end cap. Now it's time to get that end cap in place. On the left side, I'm running into an issue with my door trim, so what I did is I held that end cap up in place right against it, and I just drew a line right down the side here. I'm going to use my multi-tool to take out that wood. Speaking of which, I'm using the multi-tool here to just go straight down that line so that I'm taking out only the wood that I need to in order for that piece to fit in and for it to have a nice flush finished look when it's done. With that section of wood cut out, now I can put that end cap in place, and I simply just slid it into place, and then I clamped it and screwed it from the inside left of locker number 1 into that space. With these 1.25-inch screws, you're going to drive them just below the surface of the plywood, so it's important to putty these when you're done. I'm just using a general wood putty for this rather than making my own out of the sawdust that I've collected from this. Once that putty is in and dry, you just have to sand it lightly in order to ensure that it's smooth for priming and painting later. For sanding this time, I just used the sanding attachment from my multi-tool. It's not the greatest sanding option, but for these little spaces, it just made it so much easier for me to maneuver around inside those lockers. With the construction of the lockers themselves, I had mentioned that I had put in 3 separate areas on the back, in the top, in the middle, and on the bottom, for a finishing touch that I was planning to do. And here it is. I decided to get some rough sawn shiplap in order to put it into the backs of the lockers. I wanted to give this room a little bit of a farm kind of feel to it, and doing this in the backs of the lockers has actually turned out really nice. I didn't stop there though. I also put the shiplap behind the shoe section in the bottom. Unfortunately, I didn't get a recording of that, but I also put it in the top section in the back as well. It's giving it a real nice consistency between the bottom and the top of this locker system that has turned out very nice so far. There was one other area where I needed to put the shiplap, and it was in that section at the far end where I ran into that measuring issue before. As I mentioned, my wife suggested turning these into mail slots, and I wanted the back of the mail slots to have that same look and feel as the lockers do, so I put shiplap behind there as well. With that last section of shiplap in place, now all I had to do was put my shelves in for the mail slots. So I pre-cut all of my shelves. I'm using pocket hole screws again in order to mount them in place, and then I spaced them out evenly. Now that those shelves are in place, I can install my right end cap. Same thing that we did on the left side with 3/4-inch plywood. To get this one mounted, I screwed it in from the bottom area where the shoe storage is. I also screwed it in from the top area, and I have pocket hole screws on each shelf that have screwed into that plywood as well. The material I'm using for the face frame is Poplar. I originally thought I was going to create the entire face frame at once, but I'm not that good just yet. So I did an initial square, and in order to create that, I came up with my measurements, and then I used pocket hole screws to attach each piece to each other. So I glued and screwed those pieces together and came out with this large frame. This portion of the face frame was glued to the front of the lockers, and then I just used finishing nails in order to attach it. For the remainder of the face frame pieces, I custom measured and cut each piece. I followed the exact same process by gluing it and then nailing it in with my finishing nails. The glue that I used for the face frames is Titebond Quick and Thick. This stuff dries fast, but it is so much easier to work with on a vertical surface because it doesn't run. It's very thick and it stays in place so that you have time to get the material up against the surface there before it dries or runs off. Once the face frame pieces were all in place, I also wanted to put a baseboard around the bottom of this. Now, I mentioned before that I had created that 3-inch toe kick underneath. I ended up filling a piece of that space with the baseboard, but I did want it to have a nice finished look at the bottom. When it comes to finishing this project, it's important that you fill the nail holes and sand those, but you're also going to find that you're probably going to have gaps in certain areas. Sometimes between the face frame and the actual side of the carcass of the locker itself. The magic ingredient to fix this is Mohawk's Epoxy Putty Stick. This stuff is awesome. The putty itself has two parts. There's an inner gray area and then an outer shell, and you can get this in various different colors. You cut a small section, and this is very important. Do not cut big sections. Cut small sections at a time and mix it together in your hand. This combines the two components of the putty stick to give it the hardening factor that it's going to need as it dries, but this stuff will dry fast, so you have to work fast with it. This can help fill some of the big gaps that you have on this project. It's way better than using caulk because this stuff can be sanded, and when it's done and finished, it looks as if you never had a gap there in the first place. Once that dries, I knock off the excess with a putty knife, and then I use my sander in order to sand those edges. When it's done, it is nice and smooth, and it is very easy to prime and to paint. Now, I haven't finished this last step. I still have a lot of gaps to fill and sanding to do, and then it'll be ready for priming and painting, but I hate painting, so my wife is gonna handle that step. Hey, I mentioned earlier that I used pocket hole screws to attach all of my pieces together. If you'd like to learn a little bit more about that, click or tap on this video. And until the next time, keep doing it yourself.